I guess it's Johnny Harris time.
Destination.
Look at how this dip just churns out these shitty, like, mass-produced videos. They're definitely, like, ghostwritten for him. He just films them, and then someone else edits them. How the USA colonized the USA. Well, we're gonna check that out.
This continent has some of the most dramatic landscapes on the planet, from the ocean shorelines to the alpine mountains and the sandy deserts.
Wow.
And also in this landmass from coast to coast and everywhere in between, there lived hundreds, if not thousands of different nations, tribes of people whose land this was. This was their home. But then others showed up to these shorelines in their boats. And that is when everything changed.
There's so much padding for time in these videos with just nothing happening.
The sweetest real estate deal they had ever seen. With the simple stroke of a pen, their country doubled in size. All politicians visiting Paris closed the sweetest real estate deal they had ever seen. With the simple stroke of a pen, their country doubled in size. All for just $15 million. But in this deal, which was called the Louisiana Purchase, the US didn't actually buy this land from France. France didn't actually own the land. What the United States was buying was the imperial rights to this huge swath of North America. This basically meant that France would stay out of the way and let the budding new empire, the United States, colonize it without interfering. If the United States really wanted ownership over this land, they would need to get it from the people who were here first, which at the time was lots of different native tribes. These are the people who had been here for thousands of years, way before Europeans had the idea of leaving their continent. And this land that the US just bought was theirs. Oh, and this isn't just me, like some modern enlightened person looking back and judging the United States at this time. The US knew that this wasn't their land and that they were going to have to buy it from the people living there. And their big plan was to do things
Buy it.
differently, not like the old imperial powers that they had just broken away from. In fact, George Washington was, quote, determined that the US government's administration of Indian affairs shall be directed entirely by the great principles of justice and humanity. Go USA, let's do this in the right way. So instead of conquest...
This is something that American imperialists, especially liberal imperialists, love to do, is they try to frame these declarations as sincere, rather than as simple justifications, rather than as like, well, we're going to take over and they have no choice in the matter, but we're going to frame it as something humanitarian that makes it okay. Because what these people also said constantly, it wasn't just like, well, we're going to try to buy it from them, and if they refuse, if they don't want to sell it to us, that's fine. They can live there in peace. We're not going to do anything wrong to them. No, it was, we're going to offer you like something which we're not even going to give to you because they broke every single treaty they ever made anyway. So it's like, we're going to offer you a treaty or some trinkets or something in exchange for your land. Then we're probably not even going to give you that. But also, obviously, you're going to refuse this. And then, because for us, the only option is that we take it from you, we're going to invade and kill you for it. So no, there was no justice. There was no doing things differently. There was no any of this. Like none of this was even especially different to the way the British did things. In fact, the American colonists had been limited by the British when they prohibited them from colonizing over to the West for a long time because it was costing them too much. American liberalism par excellence. You just take what the leader says at face value. And look, don't worry, I have made a whole video on this thing, so I can source quotes. The whole idea of the American founding fathers, particularly Washington and especially Jefferson, was that the people who were already there, who were already living there before them, did not have an option. Either they would sell their land, sign treaties, etc. with the white people, or it would be taken by force. They had no option. It was either they would give it up or it would be taken by force. So to act like, oh, we want to do this differently, we weren't going to do imperialism. No. We weren't going to do what they did before, even like more land-hungry expansionist than what the English were doing, or at least these people were saying. These were the English. Now they were just uninhibited by the English officials. Like, this is a letter from Thomas Jefferson from 1801. It is impossible not to look forward to distant times when our rapid multiplication will expand itself beyond those limits and cover the whole northern, if not the southern continent. These people were envisioning like the USA covering all of the Americas, okay? They wanted to take it, or at least as much as they reasonably could. These were not people who were just going to be content, just like stopping at a certain point when the people who lived there already said no. Nothing about this was better than it was before. It was worse, if anything, and it was certainly not less imperialist or not imperialist or anything like that. Native Americans were offered basically a choice that wasn't even a real choice. They were told, give us your land and we will let you farm it like superior white people do, And then later on, they ended up taking the land from them anyway, because they broke every single treaty they ever made. It was not even a choice. It was literally destroy your culture, your land, and your homes, so that we can get rid of you at like our earliest convenience later on anyway. Does that sound like a real choice to you? It says in this passage that I cited in this video, Jefferson's policy of civilization and assimilation applied only to so-called friendly tribes willing to cede lands to the white settler colonists. Indian refusal to cede lands to the settler colonists drove Jefferson to contemplate harsher measures. Recalcitrant Indians would, in his words, be exterminated or driven beyond the Mississippi. They will kill some of us, Jefferson noted in a letter to a friend, but we shall destroy all of them. In reality, Jefferson's Indian policy was a plan for obtaining Indian lands for continuous westward expansion and white settlement. Let's see how Johnny Harris frames this.
Directed entirely by the great principles of justice and humanity. Go USA, let's do this in the right way. So instead of conquest, they would negotiate and sign formal treaties with these native nations. Then they would pay them for...
Just taking this at face value is absolutely fucking insane.
Their land, fair and square. After all, this was a country whose founding document highlights justice, tranquility, welfare, and liberty. In our series, How the US Stole, we get to see how the US grew from a group of English settlers to a global superpower. But none of those stories would exist without this one, the origin story, the first thing that the US ever stole. So Europeans are pouring into this newly formed country, the United States. And the government is making deals and signing treaties with...
It's weird how the initial conquest is left out as well.
...with the tribes, allowing these newcomer immigrants to settle on their land. At first, this is a fairly peaceful transactional process.
Not at all. Like, holy shit, what are you talking about?
The US would offer food, farming equipment, cash, the services of...
This was highly limited. There were like a total of like 5, 6, maybe 7 nations who agreed to this, and the rest of them were just basically killed. And in agreeing to it, they were also turned against other Native American groups who they fought against on behalf of and with the Americans. And then they were still killed later on anyway when you know, it was too inconvenient for them to be there anymore for the white people. So
of a blacksmith, all in exchange for ownership over this land. But unsurprisingly, a lot of these tribes had no interest in moving out of their ancestral lands in exchange for like farming equipment. And this is where all of George Washington's ideals of justice and humanity really start to dissolve. The US was becoming...
Let's think about this for a second. Maybe what he said wasn't what he actually believed. Did you know that people can lie? Did you know that actions speak louder than words? You know, that's a good phrase that liberals like to use. So did you know that someone who says they believe in justice and equality and all of this, they could actually be saying that and then using it as a justification to do something horrible? Like fucking Adolf Hitler believed that like, you know, he was liberating the German people by getting rid of their like oppressors, their Jewish oppressors. You're going to take him for his word at that? If not, why would you take anyone else at their word just at face value like this, especially when you know what they actually ended up doing?
I mean, a more powerful nation. They needed more land for their booming population. So the impatience...
They didn't need more land for their booming population. There was plenty of fucking land already. But the thing is, you know, that there was this expectation they had not only built, but that they greatly encouraged, that they were going to conquer all this land. As I just said, Jefferson, who was one of the founding fathers, later a very early president, chief ideologue of this, basically outlines it all from the very beginning. They had always planned to take all the land. So these settlers, they say impatient settlers, he says, it was not simply impatient settlers. This was a part of the whole ideology of the very foundation of this settler colonial state, was expansion to give land to white people. And those white people essentially having like any sort of class consciousness satiated by the fact that they would be given land, which would turn them into bourgeois, and be allowed to work black slaves.
Settlers and their government started playing dirty.
Oh, they just started playing. They were already playing. What the fuck are you talking about? This didn't start here. This was going on for like more than 100 years before this.
Was like a great tidal wave.
You start to see what happens when these tribes say no to the newly powerful United States. In one instance, one group of tribes up near the Great Lakes didn't want to sell their land. They told the United States that this river would be the border and to not cross it, to stay off their land. The US said no, and they took them to war, and lost. Twice. But on the third time, they won the battle and forced the tribes to sign a treaty giving away all of this land, basically all of present-day Ohio. Something very similar happened down here when these Seminole tribes refused to leave their land. The US military came in, another war, killing thousands, forcing the tribes to sign a treaty and pushing them into the swampy interior of the state, where they had no access to their farmland or the ocean. Down here in what was becoming Alabama, the Muskogee...
Isn't it crazy how all of this happens when everyone just has the greatest of intentions? Is he going to question the intentions?
Nation refused to sign a relocation treaty, but not wanting to go to war, agreed to sell a portion of their land in return for a guarantee that they could keep the rest. And the United States agreed, and they actually did. And the Muskogee kept their ancestral lands forever. Womp womp, no, that didn't happen. 4 years later, a bunch of white settlers moved in, boxing the Muskogee out of their ancestral land. As tensions grew...
This is the thing, he tries to frame this as settlers, like individual settlers moving in, causing these problems. But the thing is, the US federal government, at any point, could have honored the treaties. Obviously, the treaties were already incredibly coercive, but they could have done so many fucking things. They could have sent in the US Army, they could have sent in, what do you call them? Like the Supreme Court Rangers or whatever the fuck you call them. They could have sent in tons of fucking, like, armed, violent enforcement mechanisms to kill the fucking settlers and protect the treaty rights that the federal government had agreed to, but they didn't, because they didn't care. You know, it wasn't about that for them. It wasn't about respecting the rights of the Indians for them. It wasn't about justice and liberty and freedom for them. They wanted the land. The treaties were just a temporary mechanism to take the land, you know, essentially to get them to stop fighting, so expand further, surround them, and then take it later on when it would be way easier for them to do so.
Because of this violated agreement, the US military was called in to force the Muskogee out of their lands. No treaty was ever signed. I mean,
wow. And this is a quote that I quoted in here. When forced to choose between these contradictory goals, the US federal government always sided with white settler colonists without exception. Literally not one single time did the US federal government, despite signing supposed treaties with peoples who they had coerced or conquered into signing them, did they ever actually make any effort to enforce the treaties? Not once.
The shenanigans ranged the whole...
So that should make it fucking obvious to you. None of the rhetoric was ever sincere. It was all about conquest. It was a planned genocidal conquest of all these different nations of people from the very beginning. But for Johnny Harris, he's a liberal imperialist. He's not allowed to say that. So he's going to be like, despite all these amazing intentions, despite everyone having the best of intentions, it kept happening. How could this be? We're already kind of seeing the way that he wants to frame it, which is just individual land-hungry settlers causing the issues. As if the US government couldn't have done anything about that.
Damn it here. They would get tribal
leaders
drunk.
But it didn't want to, obviously.
To trick them into signing this paper that gave them all the land. They would appoint random people to be the tribal leaders and then tell them to sign away the land for the whole tribe. In another conflict, the Sioux and Arapaho nations defeated the US military over and over until the US finally signed a peace treaty acknowledging their land. And they were safe. Until gold was discovered 8 years later, and the US broke their treaty, redrew the boundaries, built roads on their land, and before you know it, you've got a bunch of white guys with gold pans harvesting this land. Treaties and justice be damned. Eventually, other tribes caught on to what was going to happen, realizing that refusing the US government would mean violence. So they would sign the paper, take the money, and leave. Over the course of almost 100 years, the United States signed 368 treaties with tribal nations, who were driven out one way or another to make way for white settlers, who established control over this land that their government had stolen for them. And yes, you have all the paperwork, all the spreadsheets that they were making, all the treaties, a nice paper trail. But this was all a facade of justice, a thinly veiled campaign for imperial conquest.
I mean, no one at the time even ever believed that any of the rhetoric. They didn't believe any of this shit, man.
Before we go on to the story, I just need to tell you that we don't have a sponsor for today's video of supporting independent journalism and working.
Independent journalism. I love independent journalism that takes like $10,000 payments to make videos for the World Economic Forum. It's one of my favorite things.
Loads of...
This is called journalism. This is journalism now? This is like a guy summarizing a Wikipedia article for you. This isn't fucking journalism, dude. Give me a break.
Native people out of their ancestral lands so that white people can settle it. But there was one region that proved particularly difficult for this extermination project that was going down. Here in the Deep South, we had these 5 large nations that lived side by side with the settlers for a long time. They had all signed treaties with the United States that acknowledged their right to this land. Many of them spoke English, practiced farming, wore European clothes. Some even owned slaves. Because of this, these 5 tribes, the Cherokee, Chickasaw, Choctaw, Muskogee, and Seminole, were known as the 5 civilized tribes. And there's an alternative world where these tribes could have remained on their land, living side by side with the Europeans as they...
No, there is no alternative world. No, not at all. Because they always plan to do this to them.
Settled. But that's not what happened. Mostly because of cotton.
No, not at all.
Farmers down here were getting super rich off of a very valuable cash crop called cotton that they could sell to textile mills around the world. It was an industry made even more profitable by its key input, free labor from stolen Africans. There was this one strip of land down here called the Black Belt Prairie.
Kidnapped, I believe, would be the word.
That was particularly desirable for farming cotton. But as you can see, it was locked up in what the United States treaties had formally acknowledged as belonging to native nations. But the farmers down here were looking at this as like, this is a perfect place to...
He's like trying to put it down to just one cause. It was, for one, it was a part of the ideology in general, just how it was. They had always planned to conquer all of at least North America, and Jefferson, the crazy fucking bastard, even wanted to conquer all of South America as well. For two, in some of these cases, I know for sure in the Cherokee case, it was gold. The second they found fucking gold there, everyone just went right in there. But even regardless of that, if there was nothing there, if there was like no valuable resources or whatever, they wouldn't have fucking let them stay there. Especially after Jackson, no fucking way. They planned it the whole time.
Expand our cotton kingdom. So these southern slave owners did what was kind of becoming US policy towards the people living on the land that they wanted. They made up their own rules. The state of Georgia was particularly aggressive in trying to clear this land out, or in the words of their governor at the time, to replace, quote, all of the red with white population. They targeted the Cherokee Nation, passing a law that abolished their governments.
He's invoking the Cherokee, who had nothing, this had nothing to do with cotton, it had everything to do with gold.
The Cherokee are not going to stand for this, so they fight back using the same shenanigans that the United States is trying to use, the US legal system. They take Georgia to court, a case that went all the way to the Supreme Court. And guess what? The Cherokee Nation won. Like, there was no way around the fact that they had ironclad rights.
Cherokee Nation won under Jackson, and guess what? Didn't matter. Didn't matter because the court could have sent federal marshals. They could have, Jackson decided not to enforce the Supreme Court ruling. And what did the court do? They didn't send federal marshals. They didn't do fucking anything because they were on the side of the fucking state as well. No one ever did anything to protect the rights of these supposed treaties because the treaties were bullshit. No one believed in them for 1 second.
To this land, signed and sealed. The highest court in the country just ruled that the states could not impose on tribal sovereignty. But, as we all learned in government class, a ruling from the judicial branch only works if the executive branch enforces it. Oh, and who was in charge of the executive?
No one was ever going to enforce this. This was an order from the judicial branch who had their own fucking armed enforcers of state violence. They could have fucking sent them themselves to kill the fucking white people who were encroaching on the land that they had just ruled was Cherokee, but they did not because they didn't fucking care.
Executive branch? Oh, this guy. The guy who wrote a letter to his wife during the War of 1812 from the battlefield saying that he had succeeded.
I know it's nice. It's nice for Americans to think that people had the best intentions and then just some bad dudes came along and made it all go bad. But this was not Jackson. This was going to happen with or without Jackson. This was just part of what the USA is. Manifest destiny as the ideology, not the term, was something that every single one of the so-called founding fathers vehemently believed in, the endless westward expansion of the USA. And that was not going to happen with the consent of the native people. It was not going to happen with them just being allowed to live on their land side by side with the white settlers in peace, regardless of how much you can say it was, or you wish it was, or you pretend it was. It would have, if it wasn't him, it would have been someone else, or like a succession of people doing the same thing over just a longer period of time, because this is what the USA was about.
Successfully slaughtered 170 Native Americans in, quote, an elegant...
Yeah, like, for these people, there is no sort of overarching ideology. There is no historical continuity. It's just kind of like a succession of, like, individual bad people doing individually bad things.
Style. Oh, and the guy who's on our $20 bill. Yeah, him. Andrew Jackson thought that negotiating treaties with the people who were living here was a ridiculous notion. So he looks at the Supreme Court ruling that validates the Cherokees' right to their land, and he literally responds in the snarkiest way possible, saying, "The Chief Justice, John Marshall, has, quote, made his decision. Now let him enforce it." No, he was not going to enforce it. Jackson had a different plan in mind. It came in the form of a new law that he pushed through both houses of Congress. His whole worldview towards First Americans embodied in a piece of American legislation.
First Americans. That's actually kind of like an offensive term.
The Indian Removal
It's calling them Americans.
Act of 1830. This law used taxpayer money to get tribes out of the United States and to relocate them to an uninhabitable place that surely no American settler will ever end up.
The Great Plains seemed an inhospitable land to people familiar with the eastern states and of Europe.
This became their dumping ground, and it came with a promise. Move here and we will never mess with you again. And what's crazy to me is that even after all of the shenanigans, all the facades, they continued to play this charade, saying that the nation of Indians may choose to exchange their land where they now reside. The law says that the government had to negotiate these treaties fairly, voluntarily, peacefully, and that the government would, quote, forever secure and guarantee them their new land, and that they wouldn't break any of the pre-existing agreements that they had made in previous treaties.
This is like Johnny Harris, for the first time in his life as a liberal imperialist, learning that words mean nothing. Are you just realizing that laws are essentially fake bullshit? That they don't fucking matter? Like, the only reason they matter is because people want to enforce them or abide by, or, convinced to abide by them, etc. In a case like this, where the interests of every single white supremacist slave owner, which is what white people at this time pretty much all were or aspire to be, is in specifically not obeying any of this shit, then it's pretty fucking obvious that it was never anything but for show.
But no, this was just more pretending. A paper trail of pretend humanity.
Wow, he's like so surprised by this. Dude, were you born yesterday? Are you 11?
Just as Andrew Jackson had ignored the Supreme Court ruling, he had no intention in following the law.
This is for fucking children, man.
That he helped create. But he kept up the ruse. More documents, more signatures, more paper that made these civilized, justice-minded people feel like they weren't orchestrating a mass ethnic cleansing.
I mean, it wasn't for their feelings. It was for the justice. It was because this is the same fucking reason why the English would seek out treaties with native peoples and shit. Because obviously, they were never going to obey them, but they wanted a basis in their own legal system that would be sound and that would last, so that they didn't have to end up justifying any of this later. And that caused problem for them in Australia, for example, because in Australia they never signed a treaty with anyone. So it caused huge problems for them later on because they had never actually established why they own this land in their own legal system. And they had like a bunch of court cases in like the 1820s, 1830s trying to establish that. So things like this, it's just them part and parcel continuing the imperialist practices of the British, the exact same thing that they would do. This was not like to convince themselves. It was to create like an on-paper legal basis for their ownership of these territories. The things would say, well, only if they agreed to it, and then they would just get like one random person who they would put like a ceremonial headdress on and say, sign this, and they would say, oh, there you go, they signed it, so we're taking it from them now. That's what it was all about, to like in their own legal system establish their own sovereignty over this stolen land, which in their own legal system, which is entirely based around being on stolen land in the first place. So it's entirely self-serving. Nothing about this is, no one really genuinely believed in any of this fucking shit, obviously. How could you possibly talk about this for 12 minutes and think even for a second that they really did? And it also like was pretty convenient because now it enables idiotic liberals and right-wingers, etc., to be like, well, they signed a treaty. We got the piece of paper here. That means in our legal system, it's ours.
Sanctioned by the government, paid for by taxes, but they were. So this law is implemented, and the United States government, military, and even private companies start to ramp up their removal efforts of first Americans. They focus in on these 5 tribes that were sitting atop the land that they wanted for their cotton empire. More bribes, more pretend negotiations, and when push came to shove, more threats of violence. The Cherokee eventually signed a treaty agreeing to sell their last portion of land, and they moved west, out to their little rectangle of land that had been allocated to them by the government on maps. The only problem was that the leader who signed the treaty on behalf of the Cherokee people was not actually the real leader. They had no authority to make this decision. The Cherokee chief furiously protested this, but the US didn't care. They had their signature from someone. In their eyes, all was justified. Whoa. Between 1831 and 1838, nearly every member from the 5 tribes was expelled from their land. 100,000 people, whose home this was, now forced to walk by foot for more than 1,000 miles through brutal weather and terrain towards a little box on the map, a place they had never been before. The Cherokee would eventually call this journey the Trail Where We Cried, or the Trail of Tears. Some tried to fight back against their oppressors, and others stood their ground until they were forcibly bound in chains by the US government and herded west at gunpoint. Their land was vacant, and cotton farmers with their slaves moved in, and the economy grew.
This is someone, by the way, he has videos where the economy grew. He has videos where he's like, the line went up, therefore the world was more gooder. And now he's like, the economy grew lamentably.
We'll never know how many people died during all of this, how many lives were really destroyed. Some people say 3,000, other estimates say 15,000, but you don't need those numbers to see how destructive this was. It was systematic, it was documented, and it was enshrined in law. We have a paper trail of all of it, showing the receipts, the payments, the treaties, the bureaucracy of it all. It's like a bunch of spreadsheets from the 1800s. American settlers, in an effort to be...
Why is he acting like this is at all surprising? States have a very fucking long history of documenting their crimes, because to those states, what they're doing aren't crimes. So why wouldn't they document them? Is this really new to you?
Different from the old world empires they fled, ended up carrying out the first state-sponsored ethnic cleansing. There's a reason...
Are you kidding me? The first state-sponsored ethnic cleansing? I'm absolutely gobsmacked. Do you think, like, 1820s, 1830s America was the first time anything like this had ever happened? I'm dying here.
Why Hitler, 100 years later, references this exact event, this process, when he was carrying out his own ethnic cleansing. He said that the Volga, which is a river in Russia, would be, quote, our Mississippi. He said that Europe, not America, would be the land of unlimited possibilities. The story of what happened to many nations of the first Americans doesn't end here. In fact, this is kind of the beginning. We're gonna make a second part to this video, and in that part 2, I wanna show you what happens next once these tribes arrive to their little rectangle on the map. Indian Territory, the place where these tribes were forced out, dumped, and left to build a new life. And how they once again tried to...
What Johnny Harris always does is he says all this shit and he's like, oh, this was all so bad. And then he doesn't actually form a conclusion that links anything together. He specifically tries to avoid doing that.
To fight back using the legal frameworks that had pushed them out, and how all of that led to the establishment of one state in our country that could have looked a lot different.
No, none of this ever could have looked a lot different. All you need to do to know that is to look at what the fucking founding fathers said. Part of why they fucking rebelled against the British was because the British weren't letting them expand anymore. That's it? That's it? Wait, there's no... Dude, look at all of the fucking employees that he has. It's like 10 people working on these videos. That's it? There's no point?
Had pushed them out, and how all of that led to the establishment of one state in our country that... Maps are wrong, and indeed they are. This poster shows right now. I'm really excited.
Okay, that is... Wow, that is incredibly substanceless video. Well, what can you really expect from an idiotic liberal imperialist who acts like he's a journalist while giving you like a rundown of things that is less detailed than a Wikipedia article, and that also completely misses like anything of any substance to instead just frame it as if it was all like a big isolated oopsie. What does he think journalism is? That's journalism? What the fuck, man? I'm so confused. He's just like, look at all these documents. They made all these documents leaving a paper trail about all of this. Like, were you born fucking yesterday? I think the reason that he's like that is because Johnny Harris, like, for him, a source is like a mystical thing. Like, when he cites a source, it's like a big event, right? For him, it's a huge fucking event. That's why in, like, his video, China So Powerful, which was sponsored by the World Economic Forum, there's, like, this moment where he finally cites a source after 7 minutes of not citing a single source, and it's, like, a huge moment. He makes a huge fucking deal out of it.
Wait. This is a very wonderful story about capitalism and its ability to lift millions of people out of poverty and to industrialize a country. And to industrialize... We need to talk about. I have 2 graphs I want to show you.
Guys!
They look like this.
I'm citing a source. It's some graphs. Check him. These are the graphs. 7 minutes in. I'm so excited to show you these sources. I feel like that's why he was like, I'm so fucking amazed that they documented all of this.